over to the cloud.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Department of Biological and Biomedical Sciences seminar series. I'm Dr. Thomas. I'm very excited to see you all here today. And for those who are Zooming in and for those who are going to be watching this recording, thank you for being here today. We do have 3 different types of presentations in our seminar series. We have our traditional research talks. We have career talks like the one today that is talking about all of these various types of jobs that biology students can have. And then we have our perspectives where a speaker talks about the different kind of historic and present lack of diversity and equality and equity in our biological fields, and the effects that those have in our fields and in our communities. So we have had several seminars already this semester, and then I wanted to point out a few that are coming up. On March 18th, we have a career talk with Ali Regal, who is one of our alumna, and we're excited to have her come back and give a talk about working at a wildlife rehabilitation hospital and environmental education. We're also going to be having Dr. James White come and speak about his research. And then we have another career talk on March 25th talking about being a clinical microbiology laboratory scientist. We have another research talk coming up on the 10th of April. And then on the 17th of April, we have our perspective seminar that I'm really excited about. So I hope you can be here for this. And then on the 24th, we have another research talk. And right now we're going to talk about our own speaker. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Dr. Hunter, if you could share. We are very pleased to have Dr. Jennifer Hunter present for us today. Dr. Hunter was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. She earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Science and Statistics from the University of Washington, and she earned her PhD in Ecology from the University of California, Davis. She has worked as a field instructor at the State University of New York, a research analyst at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and as a project leader at Panthera in San Francisco. She is currently the resident director at the Hastings Natural History Reservation, which is part of the University of Berkeley. Dr. Hunter, welcome. You are muted right now, Dr. Hunter, if you could unmute yourself.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much for the intro. I'm so pleased to be here. I think it's really incredible that your university has this kind of diversity of seminar speakers for the students, because when I was in grad school specifically, like there was not this sort of level of perspective on looking at different career opportunities. So I think this is like a really cool opportunity for everybody. I certainly would have loved to have known this was a career possibility for me earlier on, but I'll get into that. But anyway, I'm Jen Hunter. I'm the director of the Hastings Natural History Reservation, which is a biological field station that's owned and operated by the University of California at Berkeley. So I'm going to start by just kind of making sure we're all on the same page with what a field station is. So a biological field station are typically owned by universities, and sometimes they're owned by land trusts or other sort of land holding entities. And it's sort of like a network of sites that are typically set aside for research and education. And they're really everywhere. It's not a resource that a lot of folks are that familiar with, but there was a paper that came out in 2018 that showed that 78% of the US population lives within 60 miles of a biological research station, and then 98% of the population live within 120 miles. So these places are really spread throughout the US. This is looking specifically at data from the US. And this encompasses terrestrial-based systems like the one I operate, and also marine labs. So these are places where people, researchers spend time studying the ocean. So I'm specifically part of the University of California Natural Reserve System. So the UCNRS is the largest publicly owned network of field stations in the world. There are 41 sites sort of encompassing all of the major habitat types in California. We have our high elevation sites up in the White Mountains. It's like 13,000 feet in elevation, where they do all kinds of research looking at adaptations to oxygen poor environments. There are reserves along the coastline. There are reserves in the mountains, in the redwood forest, and out in the desert. So generally speaking, our mission is sort of three-pronged. So we're set aside for research, for teaching, and for public engagement. So for me and my job, the research part is pretty straightforward. We have researchers that come to study whatever taxa they're interested in. We have college courses that come as field courses. So they'll be here for anywhere from a couple of days to a week or 2 weeks. Studying the ecosystems here, but also traveling to other nearby areas and using Hastings as sort of a base of operations. We also do a lot of K through 12 programs. So I do a kids camp over Memorial Day weekend that's free for the local community. And their kids age 10 to 12, and they get really quality hands-on time with our researchers and grad students from all over California that come to spend time with them, teaching them about their research techniques. They get to handle animals sometimes. It's a really cool program. And I also host the entire 7th grade from the local middle school over 3 days in May, and it's really a lot of 13-year-olds, but it's really fun, and it's an opportunity for them to get out here and see what we do as well. So all told, in the university system, there are around 150,000 visitors per year across these 41 sites, and has resulted in thousands and thousands of publications. The data here on the bottom right is the Hastings user data. So this is from our most recent fiscal year. So we had, almost 120 research users, almost 300 education users, and almost over 850 public users. So that's kind of a snapshot of sort of the numbers of people that we're dealing with here on an annual basis. I'm going to show you this really short video. Hopefully it works. We'll see. That kind of gives a little more background about the UC Natural Reserve System. Oops.
The UC Natural Reserve System is a network of protected lands and field stations across California. Reserves offer outdoor laboratories to field scientists, classrooms without walls for students, and nature's inspiration to all. Our research, university-level teaching, and public service mission mirrors that of UC. Each year, reserves host more than 4,000 researchers, 13,000 students in university-level classes, and 7,000 school children. Our library of ecosystems includes rocky coastlines and oak savannas, deserts and conifer forests, vernal pools, and alpine mountaintops. The NRS is spread across more than 40 California locations, encompassing more than 47,000 acres, making it the world's largest university-operated system of natural reserves. Reserves also serve as gateways to an additional 1.5 million acres of partner lands. In recent years, the NRS has become a key partner for the state of California in natural resource management. Our climate stations are the backbone of a Sentinel site network monitoring the pace of environmental change. This information is critical to helping California reach its ambitious 30 by 30 goal to conserve 30% of state lands and coastal waters by 2030.
All right, so there's like kind of a quick overview of sort of what the reserves sort of look like. Facilities wise, they all vary a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Hastings, which is my little slice of this whole system. So the Hastings Reserve is located in Monterey County. So if you're looking at sort of the state of California, we're sort of like halfway down on the the West Coast. We're about 45 minutes inland from the city of Monterey. We're located in the Carmel River watershed, which is actually quite a small watershed, but it's kind of has an interesting history in that the Carmel River is the sort of primary source of drinking water for the entire Monterey Peninsula. And so the stress on the ecosystems in the watershed is pretty profound. Things have changed a lot in the last maybe 25 years, but things are still changing. And so it's kind of a cool time to be here and to be able to document that and to document the success of the restoration efforts in the watershed. So that's just a little bit of context on where we're located. I just want to give you a little bit of history of the site. So Hastings has been a field station since 1937, which makes us one of the older field stations in the world. But before Hastings became a field station, we have about 6,000 years of the Esselen tribe living in this area. This is part of their territorial lands. The Esselen have the unique and unfortunate distinction of being the first tribe in California that was considered culturally extirpated due to contact with the missions. So if you're outside California, you don't have the whole story of the mission history of the state. Essentially, Spanish padres came and had the charge of Christianizing and assimilating the native population. And they set up a series of missions throughout the state and carried out some pretty brutal practices to kind of remove also the cultural history from these people. So the Esselen, this is their historic territorial boundaries. Monterey is right here. This is the tip of Monterey Bay here. This is the Carmel Bay. You'll see there are 3 missions that are all sort of in this area. So this was the Monterey mission. Then they realized there was no water there, so they moved it to Carmel so they could use the river water. The Soledad mission and the San Antonio mission down to the south. Hastings is sort of positioned right along the walking path the Padres used to take to get from the Carmelo mission to the Soledad mission. And so what that means is that we had a lot of contact with the Padres early on in this area, and the results for the indigenous tribe were pretty profound. We have some archaeology projects that are happening where we work with the tribe really regularly to try to capture some of the cultural resources that are here on the site and to sort of document some of that, which is kind of a cool aspect of what we do and one of the services that we can provide because this place is protected. The tribe can be confident that there's not going to be development here, and that these materials are going to stay where they were deposited by their ancestors, which I think is a really important part of our relationship with them. So more contemporarily, the homestead history. So this is Francis Sims and Russell Hastings. They didn't always look this miserable, but this is the only picture I could find of the two of them. They bought this property in 1926. And at the time, it was a collection of 16 different homesteads. So we still have a lot of evidence now of the homestead history of the site. We have a barn that was built in 1865. We have buildings that were built around the turn of the century. They had one daughter, Fanny, who they split their time between San Francisco, Palo Alto, and Hastings. And much to their chagrin, Fanny ended up marrying the ranch manager, which in the 1930s was quite the scandal. She was 18, he was 33, he was divorced, he had kids, all the things in the 1930s that you weren't supposed to be. But they lived happily together. They had 5 children of their own. And sort of around this time, as Fanny was developing this relationship with Tom, the Hastings parents met these 2 folks at a party. So the woman on the left there is Annie Alexander. She was a philanthropist and an avid naturalist and a collector. You can see she's very well armed. She's got a knife on her hip, a revolver on her hip, and a rifle over her shoulder. She was actually the heiress to the C&H sugar fortune. So she had a lot of time and a lot of money to work with. And so she kind of made it a personal mission to protect a lot of the natural history of California. So she started the Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley. She also started the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And so the first director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology was this guy in the center there. His name is Joseph Grinnell. He was a pretty well-known, and is a pretty well-known, at least in California, naturalist and ecologist. And they sort of met the Hastings family at a party. He was working in Point Lobos at the time, which is a state park that's just south of Monterey. And the Hastings invited him out to see this property that they owned, and with the idea that it may be used for education and research. And that's what happened. So they made an agreement to set aside the property specifically as a field station, which started in 1937. The university didn't actually take over ownership of the property until the 60s, when Frances Sims Hastings died. And their daughter Fanny continued to be really involved in the operation of the reserve and funding the reserve for many years. And their children actually still support us now. The family story is that the parents were so incensed that their daughter was marrying the ranch manager that they were going to just take by any means necessary, keep the property out of his hands, which is funny to me. It's sort of total spite move. But regardless, this is where we are today. So Hastings at the moment has a lot of facilities. So we have sort of more facilities than a lot of the other field stations in the reserve system. We have a total of 25 buildings, of which 11 are houses that are used for housing researchers and classes when they come. They house different numbers of people. They were built during different decades, eras, epochs. So they're all sort of older, and they all have their own sort of personality. And so one of my responsibilities is helping to maintain all of these buildings. In addition to the buildings, we, of course, we're 2,500 acres in size. We have miles and miles of roads, trails, fences. We're maintaining vehicles. We've got water wells to keep up and running. We have septic systems, propane tanks. We maintain 2 weather stations. And then we have this really extensive wireless network to keep people with access to the internet. So it's a lot to do, honestly, but it's actually a pretty sweet deal. So essentially, my job varies a lot, day to day over the course of the year. So I'm involved in research in a couple different ways. I don't actually have the time to do my own research project, but if I have things that I think would be interesting, I spend a lot of time recruiting grad students and faculty to kind of come and work on some of these things. I've got a student. He's a postdoc now, but we had a fire that burned about a quarter of the reserve in 2020. And I knew he was interested in the effects of fire on wildlife. And so I convinced him to come out here instead of a bunch of cameras. So we have documenting sort of the recovery of wildlife in these areas that were burned pretty extensively. I do a lot of grant writing. I do fundraising. I do the building vehicle maintenance. I sort of develop and lead a lot of these K through 12 outreach efforts. The one with the 7th graders at the middle school is kind of a joint project between the middle school and myself, but I'm responsible for developing the curriculum and for doing all the sort of background work to make sure those programs are successful. I do a lot of science communication. I work at community events, fairs, all kinds of things like that. To make sure that people know that we're here and know about the work that we're doing. I set up and maintain the wireless network, which is not something I thought in grad school would be a thing I was doing, but is nonetheless a pretty important part of the job. It just really varies. There are cattle on the neighboring ranches that get through from time to time that I have to herd around, fixing fences. I pull a lot of invasive plants. I do firefighting from time to time when fire is at the door. So there's a lot of different parts of the job. And it's a really long list. And I was sort of thinking, well, how can I make this a little more realistic for you guys? And so I kind of made a quick list of the things I did last week. and then the things I'm doing this week. And as you can see, it goes all the way from assembling kitchen cabinets and painting, plumbing, and then I met with representatives from a local state agency last week about adding a 900-acre parcel to the reserve. I've got some art researchers that are coming next week to do a really great project, and they've rented this 60-foot boom lift to do some etchings on the side of the barn. They've never operated a boom lift before. Prior to coming here, I had never operated a boom lift before, but we actually have a lot of documentaries that are made about a long-term project we have on acorn woodpeckers. And so I've gotten pretty good at driving these ridiculous boom lifts around. So that's on the docket for this week. So it's really a varied job. And I think I'll talk a little bit more here about the pros and cons, but I think for folks who like to do different things and who get excited about learning, a job like this is a really, really interesting way to spend your time. So as of 2024, there are 41 UC field stations. Of those, there are 31-ish station directors. And so that's a person who's responsible for the maintenance, the operation, the administrative parts of these sites. And so there are some places where a director will manage more than one site if they're kind of small reserves, or if they don't have much in the way of facilities. So while there are 41 sites, there's only 31-ish people in charge of them. And of those, 16 more or less are live-in. So my position is a live-in position. So I am provided with housing. The university pays my housing costs, they pay my utilities, they pay for a vehicle, multiple vehicles for me to use, which is honestly pretty great. But it's sort of an on-call position. So I live on site, which means I need to be responsive to people if something happens here. If the septic tanks back up, if the internet goes down, if there's a car accident, if there's a rattlesnake outside one of the buildings, all of that kind of stuff. I get calls all the time of like breakers flipping, it's just, it's not uncommon for me on a weekend to come up here and spend a few minutes fixing something for a group that's here. So that's kind of can be a tricky thing to navigate. But nonetheless is definitely part of the job. The starting salary, and I kind of eyeballed this, given what I know about the people that were hired most recently, and obviously this is California, which is a very expensive place to live. But the starting salary, depending on experience, I would say is probably $75,000 to $90,000 a year. And if you, again, think about the fact that housing's provided, it's not a bad deal. And it's state work. So technically we're state employees. So like, for example, I have a pension and I have 2 retirement plans that I can pay into. And so it's a pretty attractive, I think, financially, given the work that I'm doing. I think it's I'm pretty happy with it. Most of these places require a bachelor's degree, but prefer an advanced degree. I have a PhD, which I don't know how useful that is in the job. I mean, I think, research-wise, it's nice to have the perspective. And in terms of the hierarchy, University of California is a very hierarchical system. And sometimes that comes in handy to put doctor in front of your name for whatever stupid reason. But that's not entirely the case. I mean, I think if you have the right experience, a bachelor's degree would be absolutely adequate to do the job. And I'm talking about field stations, but I think a lot of these same skills and experience and things would apply to things like wildlife refuges or properties that are owned by land trusts. Often we'll hire a caretaker whose job it is to make sure everything keeps running, deal with docents, deal with students, that kind of thing. So there's certainly some pros and cons. I think the biggest pro for me is the autonomy part. I get to do the things that are important to me, which in an academic or academic sort of adjacent job, you don't often get to do. So I get to prioritize the programming that I think is best suited to the community that we're located in. I get to reach out to researchers who I think have interesting perspectives to add to our sort of research community. And I think that it's really satisfying to be able to conceive of an idea, to kind of bring it to fruition and then see the payoff, I think is really terrific and is not common to a lot of sort of career options. I spend a lot of time inside, I spend a lot of time outside, and I can choose those times. So when the weather's really terrible and cold, I can do all my office work. And when the weather's beautiful and the flowers are out, I can be outside wandering around. And I do. The work-life balance is pretty good. It's super, super flexible. So I can take the kids to their dentist appointments and their orthodontist appointments and their soccer games and their soccer practices and all the things. I have a lot, because I put in a lot of time on off hours. I have a lot of freedom to take time off when I need to during the week. That's also kind of a con, actually. Like the time management part is a challenge. There's a lot to get done. I mean, if you think about, I have a guy who works here with me who's coming in to meet with me after this talk so we can go through our to-do lists, which are really long in preparation for the spring, which is sort of our busy season. So that can be a real challenge. We're resource poor, so we don't have very much money. I mean, we're part of the UC, which is ostensibly this super wealthy, but publicly funded university system, but not a lot of that trickles down to us, particularly as part of UC Berkeley, which is such a massive university and they have so many different research units. We don't get a lot of face time with the administration. And so we're essentially responsible for generating our own operations budget through charging use fees to our users. Staffing is pretty bare bones, which is fine. I mean, but there are times when you need another body or another couple of bodies to get a big job done. And so we just kind of have to make do with what we have. And then I have this circular value system. So our value to the university is based on how many university students we're serving. But if we don't have the resources to support a lot of university students, we can't show that value. So it's kind of like a chicken egg sort of scenario. Where, we're always sort of competing for or really find out a number of resources, but we can't do the thing to show the value unless we have the resources. So that's kind of a drag. And then work-life balance is also kind of a problem because you have to really have the internal fortitude to set your own schedule and to maintain that and to protect your time. I have mixed success with this. I don't know how many, 10 weeks, 12 weeks of vacation saved up. I'm here a lot because we have users coming and going, and I feel this sort of sense of responsibility for everybody's experience. It's very hard to leave. And then also I live at work. And so it's hard to go home and turn off when I'm living in a university house and I want to make improvements to it. And like all the things that go wrong there, like that's still technically work. It's sort of a tricky line and sort of thing to navigate. But I mean, I think on the whole, the pros way outweigh the cons for me. It's just things to keep in mind if you're thinking about a job like this. So I'll kind of with that kind of wrap up the information about the job specifically, but then I'll talk about how I got here. My path to this job was atypical, I think. And I'll talk a little bit about why. And I made this for a talk I give to a student group that's here. And this is kind of the journey in a nutshell. I, in high school, was really interested in animals. I was interested in being outside. I liked working with my hands. And I thought I can be a zookeeper or a veterinarian. And I didn't really think that there were other options that tick those boxes than those two things. When I started my undergrad at the University of Washington, I got a job as a medical assistant, which was totally great because it paid really well. And I loved it. And so from there, I got a job as a vet tech because I thought, oh, this veterinarian path is going to be the thing to do. And you can see there's a big X out through the veterinarian because I was in that for a couple of months and I thought, well, this is terrible. I don't want to do this. Part of the problem was the two veterinarians I was working with were in the process of getting divorced. and they didn't tell me that, and they owned the practice together, and it was a mess. But I also did not like cats, honestly. And then I didn't like dealing with sort of the emotions and the complicated sort of social dynamics of the owners. I just thought, well, this is not for me. I was also at the time volunteering at a wildlife rehab clinic, which got me really interested in wildlife. And then I ended up doing a study abroad in Namibia, which I'll talk about in a second. And then that turned me into wildlife science, which was a degree I ended up getting at University of Washington. So I started on the wildlife science path. I did another study abroad in Madagascar. And then through that experience, I got some work experience working as a field instructor for a tropical marine ecology class in Honduras. And so those kind of were the key things I think that helped me develop my interest in wildlife and then get into grad school. And so once I got into grad school, I went to University of California, Davis. I studied ecology, physiology and evolution, animal behavior, and community ecology. I can talk a little bit about, I'll mention my research down the road here, but I think the thing that kind of I wanted to do when I started grad school was to do something that was really applied. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to solve a problem. And I had mixed success at that, but I'll get to that later. But the key experiences from that were Namibia, Madagascar, and Honduras. So in 1999, I did a study abroad trip to Ochiwarongo, Namibia. So my grandmother died and she left me $10,000. And I used that money to fund this study abroad. And it was a total lark for me. I had health problems as a teenager, and I had sort of had those problems cured, and I was like ready to see the world. So I thought, let's do it. I got course credit through Utah State University, which was great. The coursework was like environmental science, environmental politics, and methods. It was really heavy on methods. So we did our own research projects. And so I studied how carnivores avoided roads. And we worked really closely with a group called the Cheetah Conservation Fund as well, which was totally great. We spent a lot of time cutting up meat to feed cheetahs, bizarrely enough. But so that was such a formative experience for me that the following year, I applied for another study abroad program through the State University of New York at Stony Brook to go to Ranamafana National Park in Madagascar. So I lived in a camp in the forest and studied activity patterns in black and white rough lemurs for 4 months, and it was incredible. I got a leech in my eye, which is one of the better stories I have to tell people. But it was really great. And then from that, so the woman who was the instructor on the Madagascar trip ended up employing me as a field instructor for her Honduras class that she taught through a bunch of different SUNYs over the years. And it was sort of off and on, like a couple of weeks, a week to 2 weeks, a year for several years. But it was basically a free trip for me to go to Honduras. I got a little stipend to pay my expenses. I helped students conduct research projects. The instructor and I worked together on a project on dolphin communication and behavior, which was really great. And I think for me and for grad school in ecology or ecology adjacent fields, I think this research experience was kind of a really key element. So I ended up with a publication. So when I started grad school, I already had my first publication, which was really exciting. I got my research experience via these 2 study abroads, but I think most folks work as field techs for research projects sort of over the summer. It's not very well paid work, which is a whole other thing, but it's research experience, it's time outside, it's learning techniques, it's connecting with faculty, which I think is a really important part of sort of moving on to grad school. There are also these programs called research experience for undergrad programs that are managed by NSF that I think that pay actually quite well, but provide sort of similar experience for people who are interested in grad school. So this is where I started. I got my bachelor's in wildlife science in the College of Forest Resources at University of Washington. I got a PhD in ecology at UC Davis, and I wanted to do applied research. I'd had these incredible experiences abroad. I wanted to do something meaningful in someplace cool. And that was pretty much it in terms of my career goals. I studied intra-guild competition in carnivores, which is essentially understanding how all of these species that overlap in space and time, that also eat the same things, manage to coexist with one another without killing each other outright. And in doing this, I worked at 10 different wilderness sites throughout California. And of those, 6 were UC reserves. Prior to grad school, I had no familiarity with that system at all. But I was really surprised and taken aback by how incredible these sites were and how incredible the people who were running them were. I've always been a doer. And I just thought these people have the best job in the world. Like, they're doing all these different things. They're dealing with, they had there's problems with marijuana grows on a lot of the properties. And, they're managing the federal response to that. And they're dealing with law enforcement and they're doing all these things. And it just seemed like a really cool job. But I didn't know how one does that. But one thing I did realize is that the life of a faculty member, which is sort of the career path that they set for you in the UCs, when I was at University of Washington, our departmental seminars included people who worked at timber companies, and they included people that worked at state parks and people who worked at the Department of Ecology in Washington. And at UC, our seminar speakers were only professors. They did not give any perspective for outside careers, which is part of the reason I think this series is so cool and such an opportunity for you guys. But essentially, I had been in grad school for maybe 2 weeks when I realized, wow, there's a lot to this faculty type job. And not a lot of it is particularly attractive to me. There's a teaching element, which is fine, but there's a lot of it. There's the university bureaucracy, which is insane. There's the university hierarchy system, which is unjust at a minimum. There's the tenure part. Your location is sort of arbitrary. You go where there's a job, not necessarily a place you would choose to live. The pay is marginal. So sorry for any professors in the room. The work-life balance is not great. That's not family friendly really in any way. And then there's all of the meetings and the committees and all of the things that detract from time to do research, which is the thing that I really wanted to do. And so I sort of was man, this is kind of not a great job. I don't really think I want to do this. And at this point, I was in kind of a bit of a limbo because I wasn't really sure what else I was going to do. I'll just put this up too. This kind of doesn't help either, that, there are far more people who are awarded advanced degrees than there are jobs for those people, particularly in an academic setting. The pay is really not good. I mean, for all the work and all the hours, it's for the greater good, which is, at least that's how UC sells it. But it wasn't going to work for me. And so I was kind of in this life panic where I sort of thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. I love the research part. I want very badly to stay involved in this world, but I don't want to do the job that it seems like is the next logical step. So my post-grad school life goal went from being applied research to don't be a professor. And so I had started on this sort of trajectory. I was volunteering with a couple of different groups while I was in school. I sort of thought, I'm going to work for an NGO. I'm going to work for an NGO or maybe the government, and I'm going to do a research-based job. But unfortunately, my PhD was awarded just as the economy was crashing. And so all of those jobs evaporated. So I didn't really have a backup plan, which is an awkward place to be coming out of grad school. And so this is kind of my timeline job-wise. So I get my PhD in December 2008. I worked as a contractor for the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program beginning in 2012. And then I didn't start at Berkeley until 2014. And I've sort of been working at Berkeley since that time in a couple of different jobs. But the thing is, there's a lot else that happened in my life between when I got my PhD and today. So my children were born in 2010 and 2012. We moved 100,000 times with kids, which is ill-advised. And then we were also buying and selling houses. So this is something that I tell students here, and I don't really have a sense of what the housing market's like where you guys are. But in 2003, with a combined income of $75,000 a year, my husband and I bought a house in California, which is so far from being attainable today. It's sad and horrible. But essentially, that was the sort of decision that set me on kind of the course I ended up following to get this job. So we didn't have any money. And so all of the work that we did on the house, we did ourselves. And so I started early with, construction projects of various shapes and sizes. We would just get a book and figure out how to do it and do it. We replaced windows, we re-roofed, we did all like the kitchen remodeling, we did flooring, we did sheetrock, all the things, which is, a unique position to be in, to be able to have the resources to be able to do that kind of stuff. And to have that, against the background of sort of this academic history. But it was a really busy and stressful time. I mean, I had literally put my kids to work doing things. And when I wasn't working, I was caring for them full time. And then, the Monterey Bay aquarium work, my daughter was born on, or I started at the aquarium on January 15th of 2012, and my daughter was born on January 27th. 2012. So I had a 2-year-old, a newborn, and then I was working at night to try to get my contract work done. So it was really stressful. It was hard. And then, when they're down for naps, I'm grouting floors and doing all kinds of stuff. So it was really, it's a time that I look back on fondly, but would not like to relive. But so against that background, so this is kind of what these different jobs did for me. So like I mentioned before, the Monterey Bay Aquarium work was contract work. I did a bunch of literature reviews. They have a program called Seafood Watch Program, which basically is like a best practices buying guide for seafood. And it's based on region. So you could look up, the Northeast, and it would give you a list of fish and other ocean-based foods to avoid based on fishing practices, or that would be preferred based on the health of the stocks, the fishing practices, the amount of bycatch, all that kind of stuff. So it's actually quite an interesting job. I did spend a lot of time combing through policy documents from different countries, contacting experts. The hours were really flexible. I needed them to be because I had 2 little ones at home. I ended each sort of report with a presentation to a review board that included experts. And I spent a lot of time sort of fitting the data to a very specific rubric in terms of understanding the impacts of all these different fishery practices across the board. And then my next job was at Berkeley. I worked for the Eel River Critical Zone Observatory, which is an NSF-funded program that was based at one of Berkeley's other field stations. And it was a lot of like administrative stuff. It was entirely administrative stuff. It was managing the university logistics in all shapes and sizes, hiring people, buying things, buying big equipment, setting up contractors, managing a big budget. Again, it was part-time. The hours were pretty flexible. And it kind of snowballed. Like I was working with, there were 9 faculty members on that grant, who then 2 of them hired me to do other work for their labs. And it kind of went from there until I sort of developed this really deep knowledge of the university system and how it functions. And then I jumped to another research lab on Berkeley campus that was a full-time job. That was a lot of the same stuff, administrative stuff. I was kind of putting my toe back in the water on the research side. I had a postdoc that I worked with on a research project. I was writing research grants with the PI. And so I was sort of figuring like, I'm kind of coming back into that world. And then I ended up here. And so a lot of the experiences I got in those early jobs were really crucial for me getting in at this one. Particularly with the university logistics, the bureaucracy, understanding how to get things done within the system. I think there's so much to do in this job, and it sort of seems on the outset that like the facilities part would be like the really challenging thing. But I think at the end of the day, for people who leave these jobs, it's the university bureaucracy that sort of brings them to their knees because it is dense and difficult to manage. So there's a lot of sort of work that I did that I was paid for. There was a lot of work that I did that I wasn't paid for. And then the sort of life experience part. And one of the things that I like to tell students that I think is really important is not to discount non-academic work. We have a tendency to think that, I worked doing electrophoresis in a lab is more valuable work experience than I waited tables at an Applebee's. But I think at the end of the day, to be able to communicate with people coming from all backgrounds, like that stuff, like food service, retail, I worked as a medical assistant. So I could have a conversation with anybody on any topic at any time. And I think that that is the single skill that has been most valuable to me. And so I think that, as people are putting together their CVs or their resumes or whatever, like that's the stuff to really think about. Like, what are the transferable skills that you ended up with in early jobs? Because that's the stuff that can carry you forward, the problem solving, the dealing with difficult people. Like that's the real stuff that makes these jobs go. So anyway, so I just wanted to mention that part. Just to quickly, like critical skills, like communication part's really important. Organization, I have mixed levels of success with, but is also very important. The ability to problem solve and to be creative about how to address problems and how to deal with situations, whether that's funding, whether that's managing two big groups at the same time, all of that kind of stuff. And depending on the job, like the construction knowledge may or may not be important, depending on, because some facilities have plenty of staff to handle that part of it. And so that would be less important. Physically, it's sort of important to be able to do some of the physical stuff of the work, maybe. Again, it kind of depends on the staffing at a particular facility, like how much of that would be necessary. And then patience with and knowledge of all of the administrative what have yous, like all of the disastrous, horrible, bureaucratic encumbrances to getting the job done. Coursework wise, I think anything to do with natural history, botany, mammalogy, ornithology, herpetology, all of those things are really important. Research methods, understanding how to do the stuff that you're proposing to do and that other people are proposing to do. And then anything to do with museums and collections and cataloging and accessioning, historic data, mapping that data. And then restoration ecology, there's a lot of opportunity to restore historic ecosystems, remove invasives, all that kind of stuff. And then for here specifically, a red card is sort of a nice additional training to have. I don't have one. It's like a firefighting certification. And then first aid or wilderness first responder, because you're dealing with people in isolated conditions, and it's important to be able to sort of triage injuries. And then for the folks who live in the mountains and work in the mountains, avalanche training and any like backcountry training, I think is important as well. I'll just leave. This is my last thought. That, as much as we would like to believe that we can come straight through undergrad and straight through grad school without really needing to augment those skill sets, I think that that's really important to think about. If you want to work outside the academic system, that it might be really necessary to build other skills. The budget management stuff, the grant writing stuff is so boring. It is so boring, but it is so important. because it shows that you can manage scale and scope of projects beyond like an individual research project. Your personal and professional network matters. I hated going to conferences and networking and like randomly talking to people. There's more than one way to do that. If you find someone who's doing research that's interesting to you, contact them, see if there are any opportunities in their lab. But building those connections is so important. One of the things that I realized, so I'm from Washington originally. We moved to California when I did grad school, and then we moved back to Washington. And I thought, oh, I've got a PhD now. I can get any job I want. But the problem is my entire professional network was still in California. And that was kind of a tough pill to swallow for me. And so it's not to say that you can't leave, but it's important to keep in mind that those relationships are really important and important to maintain. Your first job is not necessarily a career. So don't stress about finding the dream job out of the gate. You need to think about, a lot of times, discover what it is about a job that you like or don't like to know what your next step is. Folks come out of grad school and they think if they don't get a faculty position immediately that they've failed, if that's what they want to do. And I would suggest that, to build experiences is more important than finding that first thing right away, because at the end of the day, you're going to be able to identify the things that make you happy and prioritize that stuff. And again, like the transferable skills stuff comes from everywhere. It comes from babysitting. It comes from all of that stuff. And I think that people, and part of it is the system values some of these more academic experiences more highly, but I think we can all make an argument in a cover letter for why food service and dealing with difficult people or whatever has provided you with a lot of life skills that are hard to get in a research lab. And then lastly, join professional groups, get on those listservs, because that's where a lot of opportunities come up, and volunteer if you can. And oftentimes people are getting much, much better about paying people for their time. There sort of was this whole many decades long idea that you would pay people as little as possible or not at all, because there were so many people lined up who needed to get the experience. And I think there has been a shift where people actually want to pay people for their time because it feels like the right thing to do. But again, like if you can get a job as a field tech, even if it's just for a couple of months, or check out the REU programs NSF offers, you could get some real incredible experience, but also learn a little bit about the things you like and don't like about a prospective career. So I will leave it there. I will just give a shout out to Jaime Del Valle, who's the guy here on the quad who works with me. He's been in this area for 45 years, 50 years, I think he's lived here. He's the most interesting person in the world. He used to be a gunsmith. He was a sniper. He was a macrobiotic chef in London. He taught Lord Rothschild's children how to swim. He's just like got this incredible life story and has lots to offer. And I think I'm really lucky that he works here with me. But anyway, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, I think you're muted.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter. We appreciate all of that you've said so far. We do have people in the...
Uh-oh, I lost you again.
There we go. Do you want to walk around the room with that one? Answer questions? It's dying. Okay. All right. So we are going to take some questions from the audience. If you are online, feel free to send me any questions directly and I'll read them to the speaker. And do we have any questions from the classroom? Go ahead.
I was just wondering, like, if your current career is something you look to do long term, or if you had any future goals in mind.
I think this is going to be it for me. It's a career position. I mean, depending on the system, some of these jobs are funded as like term positions. It's only a short time, 3 years, 5 years, that kind of thing. This is a career level position, staff position, academic staff position. So I get to apply for grants and stuff too. And honestly, like it's really great. I have on my worst day here, I will go, but what else would I be doing? you know? So yeah, this is it for me. I'm going to retire the moment I can. But I think I'll be here, barring some unseen circumstance. I'll be here till the bitter end.
You mentioned firefighting, and I just wanted to find what was your experience with that? Like what happened?
It was very exciting. So we had in 2020, we had it's all tied into climate change and is a total bummer because it's going to be a thing that happens all the time. But we had a tropical storm that spun out of the Eastern Pacific and came right up the coast, and we had dry lightning in August, which is the worst case scenario. So it touched off, I think, 200 fires in the state. There were 3 right around us. And so we watched it coming. Like I could see the big smoke plume. It was the first one that started. Actually, the first one started by a lightning strike. The second one started by someone dragging a chain, but off a trailer. But regardless, so the first one, you could see the big smoke plume, and it just like marched in our direction. It started 15 miles away in Salinas. And we just watched it come closer and closer. But resources were spread so thin throughout the state that we did not have a CAL FIRE response that we would normally have. We also have a local fire district that would have responded, but the second fire that started just down the road, I think it started on maybe 4 or 5 days after the first one, was literally in their backyards. Their houses were burning down. So the Kishawa fire, which is our fire district, they were all fighting that fire in Kishawa. Meanwhile, this other one was marching towards us. We evacuated. I didn't know what to do because I was like, I don't know how to do this. So we evacuated and got all our animals. We have like a bunch of goats and chickens and the dogs and the kids, and we got everybody out. The air quality was really, really bad. And it became clear. I was getting texts from the neighbor, our neighbor who has a ranch didn't leave. And our neighbor on the other side, who has another ranch, texted me and said, there's a fire the fire's on Red Hill, which is a big hill behind where I'm sitting right now. So I knew it was on the reserve. I have a volunteer who had a cell phone remote camera or a cell uplink remote camera. And he sent me a picture of a whole hill on fire behind one of our other houses. And honestly, the thing that got me back, and this is a university bureaucracy problem, is I had just bought this truck through the university, and there was no way I was going to go through that again. So I drove back into the fire to rescue this truck. And as we came in, there was no CAL FIRE here at all. The fire was burning past the office where I am here, like the whole hill behind where I'm sitting burned. It was trying to jump across the drainage to my right. And so I was trying to protect these buildings. So I literally was out here with a garden hose, spraying the fire, trying to keep it out of the trees. So the trees like hang over, these oak trees, almost to the ground. And then as soon as the fire gets up into the trees, it just goes up, and then you end up with these crown fires, which you don't want. Otherwise, it was just burning grassland and thatch, which was going more slowly than I sort of imagined it would have. I mean, you've seen these videos of like this like wall of inferno. It really wasn't that way. I would not have stayed if it was a wall of inferno. And so, yeah, my husband and I, who's a software developer and not a firefighter, just grabbed hoses and chainsaws, and we ended up like cutting down vegetation that was in the way and trying to think about like, well, how's this fire going to move? Where's it going to go? we were trying to protect our house. So our house is like about a mile from the main areas of the reserve. It was the furthest from the fire, but it was pretty vulnerable because it's up against this big hill. So you can imagine the fire goes up a hill, it burns all the vegetation, which then is like flaming vegetation rolling down. And then you have a real issue if you're right at the base of that hill, which is where we were. So, you know, in the long run, I don't know if it was ill-advised. We certainly weren't going to be heroes. And we certainly, when CAL FIRE finally did arrive on the scene, tried to stay out of the way, because the last thing they need is a couple of yahoos running around with garden hoses, you know, messing up the whole plan. I found the experience with CAL FIRE very difficult. They don't like, I don't want to make a blanket statement. It's a very machismo kind of organization. They didn't have a lot to say to me. I had to send my husband, who was a white guy, to ask questions. They would not talk to me. We had neighbors that evacuated, and I was up at one of our weather stations looking at, you know, because we've been putting out little spot fires and stuff. And you could see there was this big like smoke column coming from kind of the neighbor's house. And so I go driving down we have an easement road that they get access to their property from. So I go driving down that road, and I ran into a captain coming out, and I said, "Hey, I just want to see what's going on down there. You know, we're kind of keeping an eye on the neighbor stuff." And he goes, "It's a fire, lady." And I was like, "Cool, man. Thank you. It's really helpful." Yeah, so it was pretty exciting. And it was important, I think, to be here and to understand both how fire would operate here, like where were our pinch points, where are places where we would be at risk, but also understanding how the fire response works. So Kashawa Fire, who again is our fire district, they do training here. Like they do their summer training, clearing around buildings and stuff here. So they're ready to go. Like if we have Jaime, who I work with, who's this guy, is also the battalion chief for Kashawa Fire. So our best case scenario is that they respond. CAL FIRE was just really difficult. And they were coming from all over. And we have these little narrow country roads, and to have these guys driving these dozer transporters with these 12-foot wide bulldozers on them on these roads they've never been on was terrifying. And then they also closed the roads in and out, so we couldn't leave. Once we were in, if we left again, we wouldn't be able to get back. They do what's called a hard closure. And so there was a guy who's a local chef who would bring us food, because we had no power for 3 weeks. And our water is tied to our power. We don't have stored water at our house, so we didn't have water for a while until we could get an electrician to come help rewire our pump. You know, it's really complicated and messy, and I've made a lot of improvements since that time, so we are better prepared next time. But yeah, it was a really different, exciting experience.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I just sent you a little chat. Can you see that?
I can. Oh yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I was wondering about your experience as far as being a Black woman in ecology, what your experience has been. It's not always what we're told about.
Right. It was okay. I mean, I grew up in Seattle, right? So I have been comfortable being the only brown person in a room. That's an experience that I had a lot as a kid growing up. I did gymnastics. I had that experience there. And so I was more, I think, resilient to those experiences in grad school than other folks might be, just because of happenstance. It was definitely difficult. I had most people, I say most, that's probably not fair. Several people told me, and I assume more people than told me, felt that I likely got into this really high-ranking program because I was Black, because I checked a box, not because I had all this research experience and I had a publication and I was hitting, I was ready to go. I was told by my roommate that I got my NSF graduate research fellowship because I was Black. And it's like this sense of always having to prove yourself.
Yeah.
And I found that, and that's something that has stuck with me enough that when I applied for this position, knowing that it's mostly white men who do this job, that I had a credibility gap, that I had to bridge. And so I literally, this is so funny that you mentioned this, because this is literally this picture right here. My son took this picture of me when he was 5. I gave him my camera and I said, point this at me, take a picture. Because I was applying for this job and I thought they're never going to believe me when I say I can use tools. And so I had to have evidence, which maybe I didn't, but I certainly felt like I needed to. So it was hard. It was certainly hard. It was not something, you know, I feel like my undergrad experience was better, not more diverse, but certainly I think a better experience. I was really surprised when I came to California how much race factored into things in a way that I didn't really feel it in Washington. You know, there's always, we all have 1,000 stories, which, you know, we don't have to relive, but it was hard. I definitely felt out of place. I definitely felt, I saw a quote from someone on Twitter that said, when I'm the only Black person in a room, I don't feel exceptional. I only feel alone. And that's, you know, really common. And I think being out here and being in a rural environment, like that's kind of stressful because, you know, politically people here are not really in line with where I am politically. So that can be difficult. But I feel like, honestly, with COVID and like kind of the Zoom age, a lot of that's like, there's community now in a place where there wasn't before. I'm sorry that Twitter has sort of crashed and burned over the last couple of years, because that was a place where I was involved with the planning of Black Mammologist Week, which we did as part of like there was like Black in Marine Science and Black in Astronomy. And like we were one of the weeks. I'm wearing the shirt right now. And I think that was a really important for folks to find each other and to communicate with each other, because we have these sort of common experiences and not necessarily enough contact with one another to be able to talk about them. So yeah, I mean, it's not, it's a harder road to hoe for sure. I think it's gotten much, much, much better. I almost, and I took the slides out, but I was looking at NSF graduation rates for folks with master's and bachelor's degrees in agriculture, in the natural sciences. And, you know, all the diversity efforts that when I was coming through grad school and stuff that were happening, they haven't really manifested in terms of like increasing the number of participants and people graduating. So it's difficult for sure, but I think there's community now in a way that there wasn't before, which makes me hope that folks coming up will have an easier time.
Thank you. We have a few more questions and we have 3 minutes left.
Sure.
Hi, you emphasized the importance of networking throughout your presentation. So what are some suggestions and tips you have for undergrads to practice and get involved with networking?
I think attending things like this and asking questions like that are important. I think if there are faculty members or grad students that you interact with who may be TAs in classes or teaching classes, whose work you're interested in, or you'd like to do something in their lab with them, I would reach out. And sometimes they can give you, oftentimes they can pay you. Sometimes they can give you a job to do that will help build that experience. And then those networks, you know, you work in a lab and those grad students go on and you know those grad students, and it just sort of goes from there. So I would say reach out to folks and look for opportunities at Rowan and see what you find.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left. Could you address, I have a question from online. What kinds of biodiversity monitoring do you do at your field station?
So we have a camera network. We have a camera every 750 meters that we're looking at terrestrial wildlife. We have 2 weather stations that are constantly collecting data on atmospheric conditions. We have phenology cameras that are not online at the moment, but are continuing to collect data on tree phenology. We have cover boards and other herp traps where we're looking for herp diversity. A lot of that varies with time and with personnel. But we sort of have a lot of projects that are continually going and collecting data.
Great. Thank you very much. We are pretty much out of time, so I'd like to appreciate that you were here today. If everybody could. Thank you so much for speaking with
welcome.
us.
No problem at all. Have a good one. If anybody has questions